Good morning. Merry Christmas to you. Have you been saying that often? I have. I just get in the Christmas spirit, and I'm doing it all the time. But anyways, Merry Christmas to you. Merry Christmas to all of those of you who are watching online. My message is a little bit different. Normally on Christmas or the Sunday before Christmas, you have a traditional Christmas service with a traditional Christmas message. But you know me, I'm more of a teacher. I want to go a little bit deeper. What I really want is by the time we finish with this service that you can say, wow, that's good. I can use that. This will help me. And I promise you we're going to be touching on a subject that I think affects just about everyone. But anyways, 2 weeks ago we began a new series entitled Keeping Christ in Christmas. And this morning we're going to continue with that series and talk about relationships. And to be more specific, we're going to talk about how to keep Christ in Christmas when dealing with dysfunctional family members. Yeah. Or you might say it like this: how to have a dysfunctional family Christmas without losing your Christianity. And trust me, this is a very needed sermon because very few families are healthy. Very few families are normal. Most families are dysfunctional in one way or another. Now, everyone knows what I mean by dysfunctional, right? We throw out terms all the time, and unless you went to college and had psychology and maybe got your degree in psychology, sometimes we throw out these terms and people don't know what they mean. So even though it's a simple term, I think I'll define it. The word dysfunctional means that the way you function or the way that your family functions is abnormal. You see, the prefix dys means abnormal. And when you add it to the word function, it means to function in an abnormal way. So if you have a dysfunctional family, it means that your family does not function the way it's supposed to. As an example, some of you might think that yelling at each other and telling each other to shut up is normal because that's what you grew up with. But people, that's not normal. That's abnormal. And if your family does that or you do that, you're in a dysfunctional family. That's all there is to it. Now, sometimes everyone in the family is normal and emotionally healthy, with the exception of one person. But all it takes is one person to turn a normal, healthy family into a dysfunctional family. Trust me, I know. I grew up in a family that was once a healthy, normal family, but because of one person became a dysfunctional family. So I know. One person can change the whole dynamics of a family. In other words, one person can change the way that each person in the family interacts with each other. In fact, let me show you a video that illustrates how one person can turn a healthy family into a dysfunctional family. And let me just say this, it's hilarious, but there's a lot of truth to it. So let's run that video. It's okay to laugh, people. It's all right, all right. Is that your family? Is there one person that you have to walk on the eggshells around so you don't set them off? Or maybe there's more than one person like that in your family, and they always seem to ruin the holidays for everyone else. What do you do? Well, this is what this sermon is all about. I'm going to show you how to keep Christ in Christmas when dealing with dysfunctional family members. In other words, I'm going to show you how to have a dysfunctional family Christmas without losing your Christianity. So let's start with the basics, and let me begin by giving you a principle. Everyone knows what a principle is, right? If you come here on a regular basis, you know what a principle is. But if you've joined us online in the last 6 months, maybe you don't know. So let me give you a definition of a principle. A principle is a fundamental truth that explains how something works. As an example, marriage principles are fundamental truths that explain how marriage works. If you have 2 or 3 of the most important principles, then you're going to have a good marriage if you apply those principles because you know how marriage works or is supposed to work. Therefore, you know how to have a good marriage. Financial principles are fundamental truths that explain how finances work. If you understand those principles and you apply those principles, then you're going to be successful financially. Parenting principles are fundamental truths that explain how parenting works. The more parenting principles you know, the more successful you'll be as a parent. But that's what a principle is. Well, this morning I'm going to give you a life principle. A life principle is a fundamental truth that explains how life works. So here it is. If you're taking notes, write this down. Life is all about relationships. Life is all about relationships. In other words, when it comes to what's most important in life, it's not material things, it's relationships. Notice what Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, verse 15. Then he said, beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own. Now, if life is not measured by how much you own, what is it measured by? If it's not measured by the type of car that you drive, the type of house that you live in, the clothes that you wear, how much money you have in the bank, then how is it measured? Well, according to Jesus, it's measured by our relationship with others. In fact, let me prove that to you. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 through 40, and let's find out what Jesus said is the most important thing in life. Because we want to know that. Wouldn't you hate to get to heaven and find out that the most important thing in life you didn't know about and you weren't doing? Yeah. So, notice what Jesus said. Here it is. One of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, by first, he doesn't mean it's the first one listed. He means it's the first on the list. It's top priority. It's number one. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, listen to this. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Now, I want you to notice in verse 36, an expert in law asked Jesus, which commandment is the most important? Now, everyone knows what a commandment is, right? A commandment is a command to do something. It's an order. So notice what the expert in the law asked Jesus. He said, of all the things that God has commanded us to do, which is the most important? In other words, if we made a list of everything that we're supposed to do, if we made a list of all 613 commandments in the Mosaic Law, which one of those would be the most important? Yeah. Now, Jesus didn't have to think about it. In fact, he didn't even hesitate at all. Of all the things that we're supposed to do, the most important thing in life is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first on the list. This is the greatest commandment. In other words, on the list of things that we're supposed to do, of the 613 commandments, the most important one, the number one, according to Jesus, is to love God. Yeah. So what's the second most important thing? Well, look at verse 39. A second is equally important. It doesn't mean it's almost important. He says equally important. It's still number two because God is always number one. But it's equally important. Love your neighbors as yourself. So number two on the list is loving others. So take a look at what Jesus said our two top priorities should be, or the two most important commandments. Number one, the most important thing in life is to love God. The second most important thing is to love others. Now I want you to notice that Jesus only listed two things when he was asked what's most important. He didn't say, whoa, there's a third thing. Jesus didn't do that. Why? Was Jesus trying to tell us something? I believe that he was. I think that he's trying to tell us that life is all about relationships. You see, it's relationships that's important in life, not material things. Now, this is so important that I need to say it, but I need to say it in a different way to make sure that you get it. The man asked Jesus, what is most important? And Jesus answered, it's not what's most important, it's who is most important. In other words, material things are not important, people are. Now, if you don't believe that, think about what happens when a loved one becomes gravely ill and you think that they might die, such as a child. You know, if your child gets sick and you hear the doctor and the doctor says, well, you know, this is serious. They could potentially die from this. All of a sudden, you could care less about the type of car you drive or the house that you live in or how much money you make. You give it all away if it would make your child better. That's when you realize that material things are not important in life. What's important in life are relationships. It's people. So, let me give you that life principle one more time. Here it is. Life is all about relationships. Now, why is this important when it comes to family members who are dysfunctional? Well, I'll tell you why. It's important because when you have a dysfunctional family, you have to constantly remind yourself of this. You see, it's only human nature to want to cut off any connection or relational ties that you have with dysfunctional family members because it's just easier. And it makes the holidays so much more enjoyable. But we have to remind ourselves that as Christians, we have an obligation to love them and also to let our light shine in order to be a witness to them. We might be the only Bible they ever read. So we need to understand that we have an obligation, if at all possible, to keep the connection, to keep those relational ties to those dysfunctional family members. Oh, crap. Don't you hate that? However, but, there's always a but, right? Sometimes it is necessary to cut off all connections and relational ties with certain dysfunctional people in your life. But you don't do it because it's easier. You do it because it's necessary. Turn to Romans chapter 12, verse number 18, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Paul writes this: if it be possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now, I want you to notice that this is a conditional clause. In other words, he says, if it be possible. Now, that's important because it tells us that sometimes it's not possible. Yeah. You see, there are some people that you can't get along with no matter what you do. In those cases, you do have to cut off all relational ties. You have to cut off all connections with them. So how do you know when it's time to cut it off? How do you know when it's not possible to carry on a relationship with them? Well, here's another principle. And if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Remember, principles explain how things work. If you want to know how relationships work when it comes to dysfunctional people, I'm telling you. And these are biblical principles coming right out of the Bible. And if you apply these principles, you'll have a good life. If you don't know these principles, you don't apply them, you'll have a crappy life. So, here's another principle. If you're taking notes, write it down. Anytime a relationship is abusive, whether it's verbal, emotional, or physical, it's time to cut it off. Yeah. Let me say that again. Anytime that a relationship is abusive, whether it's verbal, emotional, or physical, it's time to cut it off. And let me give you a scripture to back that up. Look with me, if you would, in Acts chapter 18, verse number 6. It says, but when they opposed Paul and became abusive. That word abusive is translated from the Greek word blasphemeo, and we usually translate it as blasphemy. But actually in this context, what it means is they began to revile him. They began to threaten him. They were saying things like, we're going to take you out and stone you. We're going to do all types of things. We're going to beat you. And so when they became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Do you see that? When they became abusive to him, Paul removed himself from the situation. And people, that is a good rule of thumb to follow when it comes to dysfunctional people. So let me give you that principle one more time. Anytime that a relationship is abusive, whether it's verbal, emotional, or physical, then it's time to cut it off. Well, what if it's not an abusive relationship? It's just uncomfortable being around them. You have to walk on eggshells around them. Well, sorry. As a Christian, you don't have that right to cut it off. So let me give you a tip to help you survive the holidays without losing your Christianity. Because you do, as a Christian, have an obligation to love your family and to be a witness to them. First of all, you need to realize that love is not a feeling. You see, when Jesus told us to love our enemies, he was not telling us that we were supposed to we're supposed to have feelings of affection towards them. No. Jesus is telling us that we're supposed to behave in a certain way towards them. Turn with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 and 44, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. This is the Sermon on the Mount, supposedly the best sermon that's ever been preached. Jesus covered a multitude of topics. When people come up to me and say, "You covered way too much information," I said, "Did you ever look at the Sermon on the Mount?" Jesus addressed about every subject there was on the Sermon on the Mount. So notice what it says. "You have heard that it has been said, 'Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy.' But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." Well, shoot, those aren't enemies, those are family members. Right? We could put that in there. Instead of enemies, let's just put dysfunctional family members. Love your dysfunctional family members. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Yeah. Now, when Jesus commanded us to love our enemies, he used the Greek word agapao. And that's a specific type of love that most people don't understand. You see, most of us think of love as a feeling. We either love someone or we don't love them. And what we mean is we have feelings of affection towards them or we don't have feelings of affection. In fact, we despise them because we tend to think of love as a feeling. But agape love is not a feeling. In fact, agape love has nothing to do with feelings. Agape love is a conscious decision to behave in a certain way. And people, it has nothing to do with feelings. That's why Jesus could command us to love our enemies, and he expects us to do that. Because the type of love that he wants us to have for our enemies has nothing to do with feelings. Instead, it's a choice to behave towards them in a certain way. In fact, let me show you something interesting. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is a great description of what agape love is. So go ahead and turn there if you don't mind. And let's read verses 4 through 8. Everyone's heard this definition of love. I'm going to read that at the New American Standard. It's a great translation. Love is patient. Love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered. Love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. Love endures all things. Love never fails. Now, I want you to notice that 1 Corinthians chapter 13 isn't describing how agape love feels. It doesn't say, agape love warms the heart. It makes your heart flutter and your toes tingle. It gives you butterflies in your stomach. It makes you excited to see the person you love, and it makes you sad to say goodbye. No, it doesn't say that. Why? Because agape love isn't a feeling. It's a choice to behave in a certain way. And normally, I read this passage of Scripture whenever I perform or officiate a wedding. You want to know why? Because at the time the couple's getting married, they love each other. But give them 2 years. And they're rude to each other. They act arrogantly to each other. They're not patient with each other. They're keeping a checklist of everything the other has done wrong. And I want to remind them, that's not love. Not agape love. Yeah. That's why 1 Corinthians chapter 13 doesn't say those things. Because agape love isn't a feeling. Agape love is a choice. It's a decision to behave in a certain way. So 1 Corinthians chapter 13 has nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with behavior. In other words, it's describing the way that agape love behaves. Now, what I want to do is I want to read that passage of Scripture again, and I want to use everyday language. Notice what it says. Agape love doesn't make me feel patient. It makes me act patiently. Agape love doesn't make me feel kind. It makes me act kind. Agape love doesn't act jealously. It doesn't brag. It doesn't act arrogantly. Agape love doesn't act rudely. It doesn't step on others. It doesn't get mad. And it doesn't keep score. Agape love protects others. It chooses to trust others. It perseveres. And it never gives up on a person. So, let me say this again. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is not describing the way that agape love makes you feel. It's describing the way that agape love makes you behave. Why? Because agape love has nothing to do with feelings. It has to do with the way you behave. It is a choice. It's a decision to behave towards others the way that God behaves towards us. Most of us don't realize this, but when you study the attributes of God in systematic theology, you'll talk about the aseity and the impassibility of God. We have the tendency to think that God needed us. You know, it was just God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus in infinity time, eternal time. And you know, He needed someone to love, so He created us. And we make out like God had this need. Aseity says God has no need. He's self-sufficient in Himself. He doesn't get lonely. He doesn't go, boy, I just wish someone was around. God's not that way. And God does not experience emotions the way that we experience emotions. What? You see, we're made up of chemicals and hormones. If those chemicals and hormones are not working properly, then we don't feel properly. If you suffer from depression, you might have a chemical imbalance. If things are going great in your life, and you still suffer from depression, you need to go see a doctor. It's no different than having sugar diabetes or high blood pressure or something like that. What's happening is your chemicals and your hormones are not acting right. But you see, when something good happens, boy, chemicals are released in our body, hormones are released in our body, and whoo, we just have this great feeling. Something bad happens, a different chemical, different hormones release, and we feel differently. Yeah. People, God is spirit. He's not dependent upon these chemicals or these hormones, so He doesn't experience emotions the way that we do. And when it says, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, it's using the word agape love, and I want you to understand, it's not that God has this feelings of affection towards us. I'm not saying that He doesn't. I think He does. But I'm here to tell you what it's really saying is, this is the way God behaved. God loved us, so He behaved in a way that He sent His Son for us. Yeah, that's what that's telling us. Now, let's apply this to everyday life, especially those of us who have dysfunctional family members. Yeah, because agape love is a choice. It's a decision to behave in a certain way, and it has nothing to do with feelings. I don't have to like someone in order to love them. Did you hear that? Because agape love is a choice. It's a decision to behave in a certain way, and it has nothing to do with feelings. I don't have to like someone in order to love them. Yeah. I don't have to like you in order to love you. In fact, let's be honest, there's a lot of you I don't like. I've said this before. I don't like the way you treat your spouse. I don't like the way you treat your kids. I don't like how stingy you are with your money. I don't like the fact that you're selfish with your time and you won't volunteer to do anything that doesn't benefit you. So to be totally honest, with some of you, I just don't like you. But I can still love you with an agape love. I can still fulfill Jesus' command to love others the way He loved us. And others includes you. It includes those I like, and it includes those I don't like. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible to love someone that you don't even like? Well, it's possible because agape love is not a feeling. It's a choice. It's a decision to behave the way that 1 Corinthians chapter 13 tells us to. Is everyone with me so far? Good, because we're not through yet. Now we're going to apply the praxis principle. But first, I need to ask, does everyone know what the word praxis means? If you've been coming a while, you probably know. If you're online, you might not know what the praxis principle is. You might not even know what the word praxis is. So let me define the word praxis. Let's expand your vocabulary a little bit. Praxis is defined as habitual way of behaving. Now, remember what a principle is. A principle is a fundamental truth that explains how something works. So the praxis principle is a fundamental truth that explains how our habitual behavior affects us. Yeah. Let me say that again. The praxis principle is a fundamental truth that explains how our habitual behavior affects us. Do you realize that the way we habitually act or the way we habitually behave affects our emotions? It does. So let me give you the praxis principle. Write this down. The way that you habitually behave towards someone will eventually affect the way you feel about them. Ooh, that's good. Because when it comes to relationships, and especially family relationships, this is probably the most important principle of all the principles that deal with family or deal with relationships. So let me repeat it. You write this down. The way you habitually behave towards someone will eventually affect the way you feel about them. In other words, the way that I treat my family will affect the way that I feel about them. This is why, parents, it's so important that you don't allow your children to mistreat each other, to call each other names, to treat them in a wrong way. If I treat my family like my personal property, I'll feel like they're my personal property. If I treat my family like garbage, guess what? I'll feel like, or I'll begin to feel like my family is garbage. If I treat them like they're worthless, I'll feel like they are worthless. On the other hand, if I treat my family like they're my most valuable possession, I will feel like they're my most valuable possession. You know, I grew up in a family where my mom would always say, "You're a family," or "We're a family." Nothing's more important than family. We work together, we help each other, and we make personal sacrifices for the good of the family. Now you help them. We grew up hearing that. And let me tell you, I had the greatest older brother, Renell. He treated us so good. Sister did, my brother Doug did. And let me tell you what happens when you treat each other good. You've got a bond. If you messed with Riddell, you had to mess with me and Doug. If you messed with me, you had to mess with Riddell and Doug. Because we built a family that way. The way we behaved towards each other affected the way that we felt about each other. And people, this is why God commands us to love others with an agape love. He understands that the way we treat others will eventually affect the way we feel about them. So he says, let's forget about your feelings right now towards your enemies, towards your dysfunctional family members, and let's concentrate on your behavior towards them. Because God knows that eventually, if you habitually behave the way you're supposed to towards them, it will affect the way you feel about them. That's the praxis principle. Now, let me give you some advice in regards to this principle and dysfunctional family members. First of all, you need to realize that you don't have to engage the dysfunctional members of your family in personal, intimate conversations, because that's a recipe for disaster. I learned that through experience. But you do have to be kind, patient, not easily provoked, or rude when they're offensive. And trust me, they'll be offensive. There were 5 of us. 4 of us interacted the way that we were supposed to. We had one that was a problem child that grew up to be an adult problem child. Now, here's what's interesting. When they became an adult, we're an adult, we would get together for family get-togethers, Thanksgiving or whatever. My dad would say, "You need to go in there and you need to talk with them." I'd say, "All right, I'll go talk with them." So I go in there and talk with them, and I might ask about how work was going. Before I knew it, they were cussing, and they were spitting, and they were all upset because their employer was horrible, and this was horrible. And then I'd see my dad over there going. So I'd say, "Excuse me," I'd get up. He said, "Don't talk about that." "Well, you said to talk with them." "Don't talk about that." "Well, what do you want me to talk about?" "Anything but that." Well, I learned from personal experience that, some people, if they're dysfunctional, you just can't have a personal, intimate conversation with them. You've got to keep it general. You've got to do that. Secondly, limit the amount of time that you spend with them one-on-one. Sometimes less is more. In other words, sometimes less time with an individual is not only more profitable for you, but it's also more profitable for them. What you want to show is that you love them. And you show love through 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You're patient, you're kind, you're not rude, you're not arrogant. Yeah. You're acting with love towards them. Now, if you have a person in the family like the one in the video, let me give you a tip that will help you deal with their behavior. First of all, the parents shouldn't have allowed that to take place. Why? Because that's abusive behavior. And you don't allow abusive behavior. But most parents, they don't mean to, but because of love, they're enablers because they don't know what else to do. They had a problem child, and they didn't know how to properly discipline that problem child. So that child grew up to be an adult problem child. And that's what you saw in the video. You saw an adult problem child. Listen to me. If you don't properly discipline a problem child, that problem child will not get better. They'll just grow up to be an adult problem child. So let me talk about problem children really quick before I give you the tip to help you deal with their dysfunctional behavior. First of all problem children share one common characteristic. And that one common characteristic is it's never their fault. It doesn't matter what they do, it is never their fault. Secondly, all problem children share the same deficiency. And that deficiency is they lack the ability to connect the dots. In other words, they lack the ability to connect the dots between their actions and the consequences to their actions. Now, most children naturally do that. Problem children don't. As an example, if you have a child that hits another child because that other child took their toy and they just got up and they hit them, you could go in there and say, that was wrong for them to take your toy, but we don't hit. If you do that again, you're going to be in trouble. And they do it again, they get in trouble. It doesn't take long before they connect that I can't hit or I get in trouble. They connect the dots between their behavior and the consequences to their behavior. If I hit, I get spanked or I get time out or whatever you decide that you need to do. So there it is. Does that make sense? So as a parent of a problem child, you have to train them to connect the dots because that doesn't come natural for them. They don't connect the dots, and I'll give you an example. We'll use the very same example of hitting. You go in and you tell that child, you can't hit, but they took my toy. Doesn't matter. You come tell me, I'll make sure it's right, but you can't hit. You walk out of the room, and all of a sudden you hear a kid crying. You go back in, and they've hit again. And you say, did I not tell you that? Yes, but. And here's what happens. You spank them or do whatever takes place, but it never seems to correct the problem. And the reason why is they don't connect the dots between their action to the consequences of their action. In their mind, it's the only thing they could do. He took my toy. I had to do that. Now, when you can't connect the dots, it's never your fault. You were forced to do that. And then one of the things that begins to take place is these problem children, they get to thinking that everyone's picking on them. Listen to me. Problem children are not stupid. They're not ignorant. But they do have a mental disability. Whereas normal children can connect the dots naturally between their actions and the consequences of their actions, problem children can't. Or they have a more difficult time doing that. And their inability to connect the dots distorts their perception of reality, which means that technically they have a mental disability. Their distorted perception of reality is everyone's picking on me. You're getting on to me for hitting them, but I had to hit them, so you're picking on me. If your child thinks that everyone's always picking on them, you might have a problem child. Because the reason they think everyone's picking on them is because they're not connecting the dots naturally between their actions and the consequences to their actions. But here's the great thing. Problem children can be trained to connect the dots through consistent and proper discipline when they're children. The problem is if they're not trained to do that, then they grow up to be adult problem children. So, Pastor Allen, what is the tip to help us deal with an adult problem child? An adult dysfunctional family member. Here it is. Here it is. Write this down. Realize that they have a mental disability that wasn't addressed when they were a child. And it's no different than someone who has a mental handicap. Does that make sense? Sometimes when I see a dysfunctional person, I have to realize they have a distorted view of reality. They don't think like everyone else thinks. It's not necessarily their fault, but they have a mental disability. Here's another principle that I always use, and it's an excellent principle. And most of you need to learn this and be able to apply it to these people who you think, man, what in the world are they thinking? What are they doing? Can't they see the way they're acting? Here it is. When it comes to interpersonal relationships, we don't deal with truth. We deal with people's perception of truth. You know, when you sit down and you talk with your child and you're having problems with your child, you think that they ought to perceive things the way you perceive it. But sometimes people don't. So when it comes to interpersonal relationships, I don't deal with truth. I deal with people's perception of truth. And perception is so important. In Matthew chapter 6, verse number 22, Jesus told us that the number one thing in being successful in life is having a right perspective on life, having the right perception. Notice what it says. Your eye is a lamp that provides light for your body. When your eye is good, your whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness is. You know, most of us read that and we go, I know something is good in there. There's a lot of meat there. What does it mean? Well, actually, this is an analogy, and it's pretty simple to understand. The key to understanding any analogy is knowing what each thing in the analogy represents. Because an analogy is nothing more than an explanation of something by comparing it point by point with something else. So if I understand what each thing represents, I understand the analogy. So let me give you, just make it easy for you and give you what each thing represents. The eye represents a person's perspective, the way they see things. The body represents the mind. You know, it's not going to come in and just tell you the brain. The light represents truth. When we talk about light, we're always talking about truth. Darkness represents what? Falsehood. Yeah. So let's insert that and see what Jesus was saying. When your perspective, your eye is good, your whole body or your whole mind, your body is filled with truth. In other words, light. But when your perspective, eye, is bad, your whole mind, body, is filled with falsehood, darkness. And if the truth, light, you think you have is actually false, darkness, how deep that darkness is. In other words, if what you think is true is really false, you're one screwed up puppy. And let me tell you what happens with dysfunctional people. What they think is true is false. They have a distorted perception of reality. And that's why when you talk with them, you think, oh my gosh. We watched the video, we laughed at the video, but you know what the sad part of it is? There are families just like that. And the person who's dysfunctional, the way he sees things is totally different than everyone else. He probably thinks his parents don't love him like they do the other child. He probably thinks that all the screw-ups that's been his choices, it's because no one likes him or no one helps them or everyone picks on him. Yeah. They have a distorted perception of reality. They have a mental disability. And let me tell you what helps me dealing with dysfunctional people. Because trust me, as a pastor, I deal with a lot of dysfunctional people. I remind myself that they have a distorted view of reality. They have a mental disability. And I would not act towards a mentally handicapped person. I would not act in a rude way. I would not be mean. I would understand their limitations. This person might not be mentally handicapped, but they have a mental disability. They have a distorted perception of reality. And let me tell you, when you see it that way, you have a lot more patience and understanding towards the dysfunctional person in your family. So, it's kind of a depressing Christmas service. But you know what the truth is? The truth is, the majority of us usually have at least one person in our family is dysfunctional. And you know, a successful Christmas is when they don't ruin it for everyone. But you know what? If you understand, hey, there's a mental disability. They're not connecting their actions to the consequences of their actions. Everyone else can see that they started it, but not them. They think, what else could they do? They had to do this, or they had to say that, or they had to blow up. And when you realize that's a distorted view of reality, but that's the way they see truth. There's a lot more kindness, a lot more patience, and you realize, you know what? That's just our family. We're going to love them. And God begins to give you that love. Thank God for the praxis principle. We start behaving the way we should towards them, and God begins to change our heart. You can have a great Christmas no matter how dysfunctional your family is, if you have the right attitude. You can have a Merry Christmas. Now, if you're here this morning and you're not looking forward to Christmas with your family, let's change the attitude right now. I want everyone just to bow their heads, close their eyes. If you're here this morning, you're going, you know, Pastor, I never look forward to the holidays. It's always bad. I want you to realize right now that you have the wrong attitude. That as a Christian, you have an obligation to love your family. You have an obligation to behave in a certain way towards them. And you need to change your attitude. If that's you, the first thing you need to do is admit it. So I want you to raise your hand right now if that's you. Anyone here? I see the hands all over. See all the hands. That's the first thing. The second thing we do is you need to make a commitment that you're going to love them. Not have feelings of affection. Don't worry about how you feel towards them. Agape love is not about feelings. It's about behavior, how we behave. So, you're going to make a commitment right now. I'm going to say a prayer. If you need to repeat this prayer, if you need to make this commitment, then you repeat this prayer after me. You don't even have to say it out loud. You can say it silently to yourself. Here goes. God, I know you love everyone equally. You're no respecter of persons. And God, just because I do what I think is the right thing to do, and I try to act the way that I should act, and I act like a Christian, or I think I do, you don't love me any more than you love that person who has a distorted view of reality. God, you love my dysfunctional family member. Father, give me the right heart towards them. Help me to see, Lord, that they have a distorted view of reality. That, God, they have a mental disability, that they don't connect the dots between their actions and the consequences of their actions. That, God, when they act the way they do, they think they don't have any other choice but to act that way. When, Lord, everyone else can see that they stirred it all up. But, God, they can't see it. Help me to realize that. And help me to be patient and kind, not rude, not arrogant. God, all of these wrongs that I've kept a record of, that's not agape love. Help me to get rid of that. And help me, God, to begin to pray for them and to be a light and to be a witness for them. God, I thank you for changing my heart. Now, with every head bowed, every eye closed, maybe you're the dysfunctional family member. For the first time, you're realizing, maybe it's me. Maybe I blow up. And I'm making excuses for it, and I think I'm justified, but I'm not. You need Jesus, and you need a new perception of reality. That nothing gives you the right to act that way, to blow up and to be abusive. So if that's you, I want you to repeat this prayer. You can say it silently to yourself. God, I've not been acting the way that I should, and I always thought I was justified in doing. I thought I was justified in being bitter. I thought everyone was picking on me. I thought everyone was just mad at me, and my parents didn't love me like they loved everyone else. But God, I realize that maybe it's what I was doing. And God, I have a distorted perception of reality because I just see it that way. Everyone's picking on me. Father, forgive me for acting the way I act, and whether I feel like I'm justified or not, help me to realize that I'm not justified to be abusive. God, I just pray, Lord, that you would change me. Jesus, I want you to be Lord of my life, Savior of my soul, and I want you to change me. And Lord, change my mind. Help me to connect the dots between my actions and the consequences to my actions, and to realize when I'm doing wrong. Thank you for that. And last but not least, if you're here this morning and you've never received Jesus and you want to receive Jesus, I'm going to say one last prayer. You can repeat this prayer if you need Jesus. If you're online and you need Jesus, just repeat this prayer. Here goes. God, I know I'm a sinner, and I know that my sin has separated me from you, and I recognize that. Doesn't matter how good I try to be, I'm not good enough. I need forgiveness. And I believe because you love me, you sent Jesus to pay the penalty for my sins so I could be forgiven. I believe that Jesus came, he died on the cross to pay for the penalty, to pay for my sin, and his soul descended to hell to pay the penalty for my sin. But I also believe that when all my sin was paid for, God, you raised Jesus from the dead. God, I ask you to forgive me, and I want Jesus to be Lord of my life. I put my trust in him. I believe I'm going to heaven, not because of what I've done, but because of what Jesus has done. He paid the penalty for my sins, and he was resurrected. Thank you, Jesus, for saving me.